Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Campfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Welcome to episode 5 of Victor's Children. There are 2 segments in this episode. In the first, I'm presenting an interview that I did with Harsha Walia, longtime migrant justice organizer, about some themes connected to her new book, Border and Rule. I think this is especially relevant coming up to Canada Day and the 4th of July in the US. After that, I'm going to be presenting a discussion with 2 other members of the editorial board of a new publication, of which I'm also an editor, Midnight Sun. I hope you enjoy the episode. I'm joined today from Vancouver by Harsha Walia. Harsha is a longtime migrant justice and organizer, and also active in many other fields, the author of Undoing Border Imperialism, and most recently, Border and Rule, Global Migration, Capitalism, and the Rise of Racist Nationalism. Thanks for joining us, Harsha.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's just jump right in. In Border and Rule, you have a chapter, the book ends with a chapter on refusing reactionary nationalisms. Can you explain to people listening to Victor's Children why you think we should refuse Canadian nationalism?
Yeah, I think there's many reasons, but perhaps I'll start with the most obvious one, which is that Canadian nationalism is really rooted in obscuring and erasing Indigenous sovereignty, and the whole idea of Canadian nationalism, and of course the Canadian nation state itself, is built on the violent dispossession of Indigenous jurisdiction, lands, legal orders, and political systems. And so I think it's really important to not fall into the trap of Canadian nationalism that often takes the form of, at least we're better than the US, because it erases these foundational violences like settler colonialism, like Canada's deep and ongoing history of anti-Black violence, and specifically enslavement. As many Black organizers and scholars have pointed out, the narrative and the myth of Canada as the safe haven and the Underground Railroad really Canada's complicity in enslavement. And also the narrative, the third thing that we can think about is the ways in which Canadian nationalism, specifically its kind of multiculturalism form, erases ongoing systemic racism and anti-migrant exclusion. And so I think it's really important for those reasons and many more to not get stuck in the trap of Canadian nationalism that is intended to placate any criticisms, that's intended to be a kind of form of jingoism, and a celebration of Canada at the expense of really investigating, unearthing, and dismantling forms of oppression.
If we reject the idea that we think about ourselves as members of nations, how should people who are committed to radical change think about our place in the world?
I think what's really important, I don't think there's a one size kind of fits all around how we make sense of our place in the world. People have different identities, different connections to place, have different histories, different attachments. So I don't want to suggest that there's, one kind of thing that replaces nationalism, right? It really is about building different senses of our place in the world. But I think one ethical orientation that I think we should always have in mind is internationalism, right? Which is, what is our place in the world? What is the role of Canada in the world? How are we bound up in imperialism around the world? And certainly one of the ways in which we don't often see ourselves implicated, not only in local, but also global violences, is that, again, we tend to compare ourselves to the US, right? Without really seeing the realities of Canada being sometimes a junior partner and sometimes a leading partner in imperialist interventions. Canada has, spearheaded the responsibility to protect doctrine, as Anthony Fenton lays out so well in his work. And that kind of new form of humanitarian imperialism that we see in Libya and Haiti and elsewhere in Somalia has really been pioneered and championed by Canada. And so I think, we have to think of ourselves locally and globally simultaneously. It means we have to think of ourselves as very much located within settler colonialism, within forms of state violence, within imperialism, within global circuits of capital production. And I know that all sounds, like a whole bunch of words, but I think there's no one way to think of ourselves in the context of place that doesn't contend with structures of violence.
Thanks. So I'd like to now bring up the Conservative Party and a somewhat different tack that they have been taking over the last year. So last September, Erin O'Toole released a Labor Day video and tweeted, do you think it's time for economic policy that puts Canadian workers first? And in this, he talked about job losses in manufacturing, forestry, and energy. He referred to people, in his words, living on the brink, living in quiet desperation. He criticized governments for bad free trade deals, as well as for what he called corporate. He criticized what he called corporate and financial power brokers who serve shareholders and seek out cheap labor in China. He talked about the idea of a so-called Canada First economic strategy that, in his words, doesn't cater to elites and special interests, but again, in his words, fights for working Canadians. And he even used the word solidarity in this. So I think this is a change of tactics for the federal Conservatives, although we have seen this kind of thing from Trump and other far-right politicians. And in your book, Border and Rule, you refer to this kind of right-wing nationalist appeal to workers as a prescription for, and I'll quote you here, a messianic rescue from the upheavals of neoliberalism. So can you share some thoughts about what you think O'Toole and other conservatives are trying to do now that they're making this kind of appeal to workers using language that they're not traditionally familiar with?
Yeah, I think there's, if we look at it globally, there's two particular trends. There's many more, but I think two particular trends that are worrying and that really weaponize the language of the left and of struggles. And, one is, as you point out, the kind of appropriation of language of protecting workers, protecting jobs. And the second is, increasingly we're seeing the appropriation of climate change rhetoric and language by the right, where we're increasingly seeing the right using language around needing to save the earth, needing to protect the planet, really in order to put forward an agenda of eco-apartheid, right, as another way of militarizing the border and securing the border. And when the right uses the rhetoric of protecting our jobs, protecting Canadian workers, it has the same impact of essentially militarizing and securing the border. Because by focusing on Canadian workers and on Canadian jobs, it's an attempt to cleave and divide the international working class, to divide workers from each other, and also to further affix race to the nation state, right? By really coding Canadian workers as white workers, as if though migrant workers are not also essentially Canadian workers, right? Like migrant workers work in Canada. They may not have legal citizenship, but that is deliberate. But they are effectively working in the nation state, working alongside Canadians. But we see that language like migrant workers and the entire program of migrant work really is a euphemism for third world workers, and a way again to maintain the division and to lower the wage floor for all workers. And so I think this turn by conservatives in Canada really mimics a trend that we see globally, as you point out, by Trump, increasingly in Europe. There's a wave of conservative politicians in Europe who are appropriating the language of labor, and also frighteningly a wave of labor leaders who are increasingly aligning with conservative policies. And I think migration is the nexus of a lot of that, and border controls, which is one of the reasons I argue in Border and Rule that we really need to be thinking so deeply about the ways in which borders are increasingly becoming the pillar through which racial capitalism and racial citizenship is expanding, and the ways in which new forms of violence are being enacted.
Yeah, those are, I think, fairly important points. And in the book, you point out, and I think again, this is very important for those of us on the left, you point out that, in your words, many leftists also call for nationalist protections in the face of transnational capital. And there are some real similarities that people often don't want to think about between those kinds of calls from people on the left and what people like Erin O'Toole are doing. So what is the better alternative then to left nationalism as a response to the real problems that people are facing?
Yeah, I think, the left response is, should fully reject other left responses that call for more border enforcement, that calls for stricter measures against quote unquote foreign workers. Like, that is just a response that we should reject. And I think following the lead of migrant worker organizers like Justice for Migrant Workers, like Migrant Rights Network, like the decades of organizing in Canada by migrant workers and advocacy organizations, we really should be calling for, status for all and labor protections for all, right? That everyone who arrives to work in Canada should be given immigration status upon landing. And then also, the right to unionization and all the other kind of benefits that flow from that legal structure. And that's incredibly important because I think it's a pivot and really turns on its head the idea that migrant workers are the ones who are lowering the wage floor, right? Like workers do not lower the wage floor, bosses and the state do. And so it's really important to refuse that kind of divide and rule where migrant workers are scapegoated for state-sanctioned programs of indentureship. And I think internationally, it means that we see insourcing and outsourcing as flip sides of the same coin, right? That in order to effectively fight capitalism, or in this contemporary kind of late stage, what we think of or know of as capitalist globalization, that we really see that as the arc of capitalism, right? Globalized capital requires immobilized labor. So we can't rely on the border because the border actually further immobilizes labor. So we need, even though it may seem contradictory, the fight against the free flows of capital is actually an anti-capitalist fight with freedom for all workers, and where we fight, capitalism by also fighting imperialism, right? Such that the division between the global north and the global south collapses, right? The ability for capital to extract and exploit and cheapen labor in parts of the global south and export processing zones against, migrant workers, against predominantly racialized women of color is deeply connected to histories of imperialism, to empire, to enslavement, to indentureship. And so we have to dismantle that global system of apartheid that even allows for that differentiation to exist, and that causes these kinds of segmentations in the working class across race, gender, ability, sexuality, citizenship, and more.
We see openly racist, hard right-wing forces like Maxime Bernier's People's Party and genuinely fascist and other far-right groups in Canada confidently opposing official multiculturalism. And then faced with that kind of attack from the right, I think it's pretty common for people to respond by simply uncritically defending official multiculturalism. Mm-hmm. So from your perspective, could you explain why you think that kind of response is wrong, and sketch out what you think a better approach is when it comes to the politics around official multiculturalism?
Yeah, I think that, absolutely, that is kind of a predicament for the left, if you will, right? Which is that in the face of overt racism by the right, more kind of mainstream responses are these liberal responses that default to multiculturalism, state benevolence, perhaps best encapsulated by the refrain of Trudeau around welcome refugees in the face of overt racist exclusions, right? Where there's overt white supremacist rhetoric against refugees that's extremely xenophobic. Then we get this kind of counter that's praised worldwide. But the problem with that is, it's multifold. One is that it really entrenches the state as a kind of benevolent actor. It reinforces, multiculturalism is effectively a form of charity, where the state continues to grant people permission and really sets the terms of what multiculturalism looks like, right? And in the case of Refugees Welcome, still sets the terms of welcoming refugees, where refugees are positioned as guests, as outsiders to be welcomed by the state, where hospitality is effectively a form of generosity, which is different, right? The discourse of generosity and hospitality is not what movements like Known as Legal are about. These are movements that are struggling for justice, that are anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, and that reject generosity and hospitality as the kind of foundational ethics to inform that work. And so I think that's important. I think, the challenges to multiculturalism have also been well articulated by Indigenous scholars and organizers and Black organizers and scholars like Glenn Coulthard, like Audra Simpson, Ronaldo Walcott, Robin Maynard, Dion Brand, and many others who've challenged state multiculturalism as a way of erasing, especially foundational anti-Indigenous and anti-Black state violence, right? By kind of reducing it to a celebratory refrain around we're all from different cultures, and even for reducing race to the plane of culture, right? To divorce conversations around systemic violence to ethnic difference or cultural difference. So that's another concern with official state multiculturalism discourse. A third one is that it is a way to manage difference. It really collapses and homogenizes communities in ways that are disturbing, right? Where the state decides what kind of box you check off in a really rudimentary way on a census or in a survey. That again really collapses, identity and structures to these homogenous identities. That collapses, for example, class, caste, and other social markers that are deeply important. And one of the examples that I give in the book is the weird thing about multiculturalism is that it positions, in, for example, the South Asian context, a person from Kashmir who's occupied by India in the same category as an upper caste Hindu from India, right? Like that makes no sense in terms of the social violences and political violences that are embedded in those relations, or between caste oppressed and caste privileged people in the South Asian context. And so there's a lot that's troubling about the state discourses of multiculturalism that are meant to evade, again, a systemic thinking and analysis of how power operates. It's a way for the state to position itself as non-racist, not as anti-racist, but as non-racist. It's a way for most settler Canadians to think about multiculturalism just in the framework of celebratory festivals or cuisine, in these kind of superficial markers of difference, and to not contend with the ways in which systemic racism continues to permeate in every aspect of our lives, right? And in every indicator of social life in this country. And so I think those are, just some of the ways in which state multiculturalism really needs to be problematized and not be seen as the counter to overt right-wing white supremacy.
Thanks very much for your time. And I'd certainly encourage listeners who want to learn more about this to pick up a copy of Border and Rule, Global Migration, Capitalism, and the Rise of Racist Nationalism, which has been published just this year by Fernwood in Canada and Haymarket in the US. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, David.
The second part of this episode is a conversation recorded with two other members of the editorial board of the new socialist publication in which I'm involved, Midnight Sun. I'm one of the members of the editorial board of a new publication called Midnight Sun, and so I thought it would be useful to introduce the project to listeners to Victor's Children and talk about it a bit. So I'm very happy to be joined by two fellow editors here. Maybe you can introduce yourselves.
So I'm Lina Nasr Al-Hajali, and I'm on the editorial committee for Midnight Sun magazine.
And I'm Daniel Sarah Karasik, and I'm also on the editorial committee, board or collective or whatever we're calling ourselves. And I'm also serving as the managing editor of Midnight Sun. magazine, which is this new project that as David was saying, and there are 8 of us on the board.
And so it's just recently launched in May of 2021. And I guess the question some people might have is, why another radical left publication in Canada? Because, of course, if you look, there are a number out there. If you think about the ones that are not produced by a socialist group, we have Briarpatch, the last one still publishing really on a regular basis in print and online. Upping the Ante is an annual. And then in terms of online-only publications, there's Canadian Dimension, Passage, and the Media Co-op, a different kind of a site recently relaunched. And then in addition, there are a number of publications online, sometimes also in print, from the various very small socialist groups. The one that stands out probably the most among those is Spring. So then the question is, why did we decide that another publication was a worthwhile project?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can speak to that as somebody who is sort of close to who I proposed to do this. Yeah, I mean, I think the ones you name are good. That's a good survey of the landscape, I think. And there's some others like This Magazine, I think, could be kind of mentioned in the same connection. Like as in this, like the magazine called This, not as in like This Magazine, Midnight Sun. So yeah, I mean, I think the main thing I would say is that I personally see this project, see Midnight Sun, as complementary in that kind of existing context. I think that, and many of the magazines you named are sort of inspirations for parts of this project, to my mind. I mean, I think like Briarpatch is a real sort of exemplar for me. I mean, I've published in Briarpatch a bunch and take a lot of inspiration from the sort of national. I mean, it's like Saima Desai, who's the editor there. I put it in one of her editor's notes recently that the magazine has, at its best, the potential to sort of stitch together movements from across the country and put different struggles in sort of in communication with each other, or make them aware of each other in a way that I think is really useful. And so I like that quality of Briarpatch and the sort of editorial standard of Briarpatch, I think, is like really sort of a model for me in many ways. And then the sort of like theoretical depth and focus of something like Upping the Ante was also for me like a kind of a point of inspiration. I think Upping the Ante is probably the closest of the publications that exist, I think, in Canada. I think it's probably the closest in some ways in terms of style and intention to what we are up to. And Spring has like a great capacity to publish like kind of like up to the minute, like very frequent sort of like interventions into what's happening on the ground. They're sort of like, I mean, among other things, they're also a source of analysis and context of various sorts. But they have the capacity to function in a kind of news, very accessible sort of news-oriented way that I admire. And so I think I was just like, of all those great pieces, I didn't really feel like there was anywhere that if you had an essay, say, like thinking from a writer's perspective, if you had an essay on that wanted to do kind of a deep dive into sort of the like theoretical, analytical, strategic layers of socialist struggle or liberatory struggle of different sorts, however described in Canada, that perhaps had like some sort of literary quality that was very sort of attentive to style and attentive to language. I could think of a handful of magazines in the United States or to a lesser extent in the UK that you could sort of approach with that text, but I couldn't really think of that many you could approach in Canada. Like it's not quite what Briarpatch publishes, like the sort of thing that, for example, N+1 magazine in the US or the New Inquiry or the New Spectre journal, I think, has the capacity to publish and does publish this sort of thing. And there are a handful of other examples. I think Salvage in the UK, like the kind of both sort of theoretical and literary intensity and consistency of the work that those magazines tend to feature. I couldn't quite think of like the equivalent in Canada. And again, I think Upping the Ante comes pretty close in many respects, but publishes quite infrequently, as far as I can tell, or at least it's not on my radar, which maybe is just like a matter of like, I'm not seeing it on my social media, these sort of like banal explanations like that. But I think the idea of having a space where you could bring that kind of work that was really maybe like quite single-mindedly, if not entirely single-mindedly oriented to this sort of question, like what is to be done, you know, this sort of like classic strategic, not in a sort of like highly theoretical or sort of highly abstract way, but you know, simply in terms of like, what should we do, you know, collectively to meet the challenges at hand? And so not just like a description of the problems, but also, you know, some, you know, qualified, humble forms of prescription, perhaps. Yeah, so those were some of the sort of like specifics, I think, and also like marrying or, you know, wedding a literary sensibility that could also include like literally publishing poetry and sort of literary writing in the same breath as strategic analytic prose, I think was a priority for me as somebody who sort of whose own literary practice or writing practice sort of crosses those disciplinary lines. So that's a bit of a rambly approach to that question. I mean, Lina, do you have a sense as like, I mean, that was me like, you know, that's me in like grant proposal mode or whatever, like pitching this project initially. Do you have a sense of how it's like distinguishing itself like in practice, maybe?
Right. I mean, as Daniel Sarah said, I think it's, you know, all of the publications that you've pointed to are really great and offer us really great insight and stories on the Canadian left. But I think in general, or ultimately, the purpose of writing itself is to kind of help clarify one's position and to make the sort of criticisms that we're trying to tie together around capitalism or racism, settler colonialism, all of these things, to make it touch down into people's everyday lives. And so because we recognize that this kind of work is urgent and important, even though there is various publications out there that are doing similar things, I think that it's still very much so missing from the broader conversation within the Canadian context and on the left in general. And so if we can offer more of that work and more of that clarification, then I think that we will have, you know, sort of done our jobs.
Yeah, and I would just add that certainly the way when Daniel Sarah first and I were first talking about some of this stuff, the focus on the strategic really struck me as important in terms of what, you know, there's not enough good thinking about strategy out there that's coming from a revolutionary socialist perspective. So I think that was exciting to me. And the fact that the publication would be open to running articles of a kind you wouldn't necessarily find together in any of these other publications, I think that could be also really, really promising. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the initial articles that have been published. It's the 15th of May right now when we're doing this. By the time this is being heard, there'll be more articles. But any thoughts on what the initial articles signal about the kinds of writing that Midnight Sun wants to offer readers?
Well, I mean, I think maybe I can offer a kind of segue, David, from what you were just saying about like, you know, the strategic focus of the magazine. I think that one thing that is beginning to be clear, maybe from the articles we've published so far, we have three. We've only three pieces live besides the editorial statements so far. But we have a bunch of others in the works. Is that there's a, you know, we're placing a priority, and it was sort of always my priority in proposing the project to derive strategy from organizers' experiences, as well as sort of broader analyses of the situation we find ourselves in. So, you know, there's always, I think there has always been an intention with this project to kind of try to go to, you know, organic intellectuals, or however you want to sort of categorize that, class that, you know, sort of to go to people who are sort of embedded in struggle in whatever way, those who also, you know, have some degree of interest in sort of writing about that work, and to sort of like try to, you know, derive or sort of like gather wisdom from those experiences. And there's a great line. Another magazine that's certainly a touchstone for me in this work is Viewpoint magazine, which is sort of international, but I think mostly most of its editors are based in the States, I think. And there's a great article in Viewpoint magazine that I was reading a while back that talks about, it talks about the party, actually. I think it's an article called Party as Articulator, I think. I love this piece. And it talks about the party as having the capacity, and this is going to be a bad paraphrase, of like having the capacity to take to sort of like take in sort of information or impulses from the class or from sort of struggle, from the working class, or from struggle, to synthesize and analyze and discuss, those ideas and shape them in some way and sort of like, and articulate them. And then there's this great line in the piece, and then submit them back to the class for verification and revision and renewal. And so I think that kind of process is really exciting to me. And the idea that like we can, whether the ideas in the magazine are coming from sort of organizers who are like, embedded in struggle, like in sort of, like right now, or it's from people who are maybe like one step removed in whatever way, the idea that we can then sort of like submit those ideas for verification to, movements and see how they're received and see, sort of incorporate or, sort of like move with feedback of whatever sort, and be sort of useful, or as useful as possible to movements. For example, one of our initial articles is by Lina Hoffman, who's a hairstylist in Toronto, and who has always had like radical impulses and has always been like deeply curious as long as I've known her about organizing and sort of radical politics. Was sort of involved in student government and then got really burnt out, I think, from student government spaces, and was just like, I'm going to learn a trade and like learned a trade, but then sort of preserved, I think, a lot of her, sort of a lot of her thinking from her student government sort of days, when she kind of entered the hairstyling as a trade. So the article is about like, how do we organize hairstylists? How do we organize workers who are told that they're entrepreneurs, who are these like atomized, sort of like, hyper responsibilized, individualized like workers, and sort of build solidarity between them. And then the other two articles, one is called Building Blocks by Mike Gouldhawk. I'm not sure if it's Gould or Gould. Spelled Gould, who is a Korean Métis writer who is based in the city now called Vancouver. And it's a really great piece on the blockade as a tactic, and the blockade, the ways that it's sort of rooted in relationships and relations of care, and the ways that sort of what seems like, the sort of peak of, or one of the sort of peaks of like militancy and confrontation is actually sort of really deeply rooted in many ways, like quite sort of invisibilized, feminized sort of work of social reproduction and care to build the trust that makes possible the solidarities that then are activated in the blockade. And then the other piece we launched with simultaneously with Mike's, it was by Jody Chan. They are a disability justice organizer and psychotherapist in training, I believe, and poet, amazing poet. Their book, their, I think, debut full collection just was nominated for I think it was the Trillium Book Award. No, it wasn't the Toronto Book Award, it was the Trillium Book Award, just like this past week. So highly recommend checking out their poetry as well. But they wrote a piece called Madness as a Strategy, which is a work of literary nonfiction, or a sort of literary essay on the ways that madness of different sorts, madness sort of variously experienced and defined, can sort of open up possibilities for opposition, can sort of like create a basis for dissenting from norms and normative expectations in ways that can seem, like there are so many, the incentives to sort of adhere to those norms are so intense that to dissent from them can seem, on its face, like a kind of madness. And so actually experiencing madness of whatever kind, can be bound up in that, in that process of dissent, sort of whichever leads, like whether it's the sort of dissent that leads, or the sort of like psychological, sort of condition of madness, or sort of experiential condition that leads, that there's a unity there that's interesting and worth thinking about. And yeah, it's a beautiful, lovely piece of writing, I think.
One thought that just came to my mind as I was listening to you talk about it, about those articles, Daniel Sarah, is that certainly you care deeply about editing. And I think one thing that does unite all those of us, in the project, is a commitment that to the idea that writers deserve to have their ideas expressed in the best way possible, and that we don't want to just be publishing barely edited stuff that gets submitted, right? That articles, ideas deserve to have the to be developed, I guess, as to the best ability of the writer. And so the role of the publication when we deal with submissions is to try to help ideas to blossom, so that we do want to have standards, when it comes to the articles that we put out into the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, like it's definitely true that this sort of like attention to editorial detail is really central to my investments in the project and in general. And I think for me it's less. I mean, it's not necessarily it's not the curatorial function, like the sort of curatorial editorial function that interests me so much as I think that I just sort of, I'm interested in writing and writers. And I think that like a piece, if we think that a piece like, should be amplified, broad sort of platform amplified, then I think it just deserves like time and like good conversations around it. And I feel like that, I don't have any desire to sort of like, insist dogmatically on a given way, a piece of writing needs to look. Of course, I think I just like, I just think that there can be a rush to get things into print or online in some cases. And what I've experienced as a writer, especially when you're talking about online stuff where you can, in principle, move so fast, right? Like there aren't the sort of like material or structural sort of speed checks that you would get with print publishing potentially. So you can like get something online like within whatever 24 hours or a week or whatever the case is. And I just think you can lose the opportunity to just like really sort of like talk through like what you're exploring and like clarify the expression of ideas and maybe the ideas themselves. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that maybe one to kind of another answer to your initial question, David, about what is potentially different about this project is I think that at least from my perspective, and I think that this seems to be a fairly, sort of broadly shared one among the editors we're working with, and we are, that we want to sort of take the time to, do right by the authors we publish and not kind of, move so fast that we're not able to offer, time and attention and care to each author and each piece that we publish. It's like we can't at this point pay a ton of money, but what we can do is like offer a lot of time and attention and care, potentially if we choose to. So yeah, I think that's part of how I'm thinking about things at the moment. What about you, Lina?
So I think for sort of the way David framed the question about what it signals to readers, what these initial pieces signal to readers. One of the things I really love about our first three pieces is just that it sort of showcases really great writing by people who are, I guess, outside of both traditional academia, and some of them could also be considered outside of the traditional labor movement. And I don't think that necessarily that was by design. It's just how it unfolded. But it does signal to readers the sort of importance or possibility of learning from a wider range of thinkers. And again, that's not because we reject traditional, academia. My own background is in traditional academic spaces, and I have, also been inside the, traditional labor movement as well. And so those are my own sort of points of departure. But I think that in acknowledging a sort of wider terrain for speaking about and analyzing struggle, and Daniel Sarah did mention this earlier as well, there's just so much to learn if we are open to learning from others, right? And so the fact that these are the three pieces that have started us off, I think is really great for us. And it does signal that, this conversation that we're going to be engaging in is going to be wider, and is going to include a lot more voices than, might typically appear in this kind of publication. And I think maybe sometimes we have a bit of a, there's the conception already of the left and its writing of being overly academic, and it's a misplaced concern, but it's still something you hear again and again, that, it's overly intellectual or something along those lines, very divorced from reality and all this kind of thing. But I think rather than, sort of speaking to that, we're just turning our attention immediately kind of to those who can provide us with really great analyses of struggle as they experience it. And so, that's the best sort of response to that kind of claim anyways, right? About what the sort of limitations of writing on the left can be. And I mean, Daniel Sarah mentioned organic intellectuals, and I think it's really important. It might be harder, to do than it is just to say, but we're so far doing really great. And for me, that's a really important part of the work that we're doing at Midnight Sun.
And this also brings to mind for me something that's in the introductory statement that we put out, if I remember right, about the importance of bringing deep curiosity to bear. And I think this really matters. And some people might respond to that kind of thing by saying, well, that's really just an academic concern. But I think it's actually an extremely important political concern, because we actually want to win, right? We actually want struggles to move forward, to advance. And we therefore need to actually be deeply curious about the conditions that we're fighting in, and about what is effective and what isn't effective in those conditions, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's kind of a pragmatic thing that should drive us to be intensely curious and questioning and about the situation we're in, and about received dogmas on the left as well.
Well, yeah, I mean,
and I think we do try to bring that spirit to the publication.
I would add, I mean, yeah, I agree completely with both what Lina was just saying and what you're saying, David. And I think the unwillingness to sort of, or the sort of resistance to to sort of debating ideas, or thinking, maybe not debating ideas, but sort of like considering different sort of strategic possibilities. I think that it can either be an admission of defeat in advance, where there's this sort of like if we are to win, right, then there are almost sort of by default there are different roads we might take. There are different possibilities, there are different tactics as well as strategies, and so to sort of abstain from that sort of conversation, or profess uninterest in the conversation, is already kind of to say that, so it's either to say that, like, well, it's not worth having because we don't have the capacity to actually choose. We don't have the capacity to act. We're at the mercy of historical forces. We just need to kind of respond, which seems like kind of a capitulation. Or it's like a will to dominate, right? It's sort of a will to say, like, our way is the right way. Our way is the best. It's very obvious. How dare you sort of like raise questions about it? How dare you, sort of sow doubt and disunify or fracture the class, or the sort of, advanced forces of it, or whatever. And so I think we just need to reject both of those possibilities. And we need to reject the sort of like implicit quiet domination of like, our way is the best and you mustn't discuss it. And we must reject the sort of defeatism implied in, there's nothing worth discussing because, we can't do anything anyway. So, I mean, I think that I think from early conversations about this project, just as an idea, which, like, to be fair, we're not that long ago. I mean, this sort of moved from an idea to an actuality in the space of about 5-6 months at the most. Like, I mean, it moved to launch in the space of 6 months, but like we went from like an idea to actually building it in about 2 to 3 months. So fast, by my estimation. And I think that from the first word I wrote about this project, I was like, this is going to get called academic. It's going to get called, like, there's no way to do an in-depth attention to ideas and analysis, not only on the left. I mean, I think this is even worse in liberal spaces. There's no way to do that and not get criticized as academic and out of touch by some people, because it's the form of criticism that presents itself if you disagree with what the project is doing. So, and also maybe it runs the risk of being those things, of deserving that criticism. I mean, we have to also be aware, that be careful not to just intervene in debates that are happening in the academy and not elsewhere. But that to me is the measure. I mean, it's like, we need to be intervening in conversations that are happening in movements and in the streets, and not just happening within the academy. And there are certain implications for the language we use and the sort of the ways we approach that project, but they're not reductive implications. I think they're not, the implication is that we have to sort of use like, a certain form of language, because we're speaking like not to the academy, but to movements and to the streets. Because I think, there are like all kinds of languages and all kinds of language and all kinds of experience in movements and in the streets. And we need to be sort of specific about the ways we're intervening in those conversations. So yeah, I mean, I think that like we are doing a thing that will get called academic, and we need to be, sort of just conscious and intentional about not being academic in our sort of substantive, intentions and work.
Yeah, I think it's also important, sort of to highlight that, some of these positions that we've elaborated, let's say in our statement on the website, are not. I want to just get away also from the idea that we're only doing this because it's new, right? Or because, in the present we need to address questions around settler colonialism or racial politics or racial capitalism, whatever it is, that we are doing these things because that's sort of where the discussion is today. But I want people or want it to be interpreted as, this is, we're paying attention to the historical reality that many forms of working class organizing and resistance have taken place in these particular ways, but it just has not been analyzed in these ways. And so when we are putting forward these ideas and when we're letting, these angles sort of, come to the fore of the discussion, and these particular writers, the ones that we are, holding up at this moment, it's not because that this is some sort of new direction that we need to go in, but because this is a feature of the historical struggles and we're simply just taking that seriously. We're taking that element of it seriously. And so that's why these stories come out to be the ones that we are choosing or the ones that we are forefronting in this magazine.
Yeah, and I think something else that this brings up is the way that unfortunately, on the one hand, you have fewer spaces for serious discussion of ideas outside universities than used to exist. And also you have more people going to university simply because of the demands of the job market, right? And these things together shape how people engage with ideas. So it's especially important, I think, that we're doing, and we're certainly not the only people doing this, but the publication is taking ideas seriously in a political way, completely independent of academic institutions and publications. And I hope that it's also going to be a way that we can encourage people to engage in political writing, right? Because a lot of people don't think that they're very busy being activists or organizers, but they may not be encouraged or supported to actually write about, reflect on their experiences and try to generalize from them, engage in that kind of analysis. And the publication should be a space for that. Although my comment here maybe just bridges to the next question that I wanted to bring up, which was about what we hope the publication can be. Any things come to mind in terms of what you really are hoping for, where we were dreaming this is going to go, what it can do?
I mean, I find, so it's interesting. I mean, like so much credit to Saima at Briar Patch for her graciousness and like support of this project, because I part of my like solicitation or curatorial sort of like approach in launching this thing has been to kind of like poach a bunch of like Briar Patch associated authors. I mean, she's like done such a great job of finding or being found by fantastic anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist, anti-oppressive writers from around the country and beyond. So I think that part of what I hope for this project is that it might be able to, in its own way, which is different, I think subtly, or depending, how you read it, do sort of what Briar Patch has done and create relationships and solidarities, or maybe not create, but sort of like that, sort of consolidate or sort of like deepen relationships and conversations with people in different movements potentially in different parts of the country and the world. I mean, I think that even though we're sort of, we're based in Canada, I think we do share an internationalist perspective on the board. And we have from the start been interested in soliciting writing from others, those embedded in other struggles in other countries, behind, fake, very really impactful borders. And yeah, I mean, so I think actually building links that then can be activated in other ways, building links sort of, in a way that is not inconsistent with some of what Mike Goldhawk describes in his piece, that building sort of the links of relationship and mutual understanding and mutual excitement, being excited about each other's sort of ideas and literary expression and so on. I mean, those to me are just kind of rudimentary, building blocks. Again, sorry to, go to Mike's, to use Mike's terms. I'm happy to use Mike's terms. Those are building blocks of relationships and of connections that, again, I think there's no predicting how those kinds of solidarities might be activated in struggle in, 2, 5, 10 years. So there's that. And then I think that, it would be great. It would be great if we could encourage the production of the kinds of writing that we're seeking, that we could sort of make it more possible, to do that kind of writing, both in terms of having a place that is a home for it, that can publish it and also pay for it, maybe in increasingly sort of appropriately sort of remunerative ways, and then share it and create more of an audience for it in Canada and beyond, in whatever small way, and and just become a sort of a go-to place for this particular kind of writing on the left, particularly in Canada, but not exclusively, and be in conversation with other writing of that sort happening elsewhere.
Yeah, Daniel Sarah already said it, but just drawing out these connections across struggle, both within Canada and internationally, like Daniel Sarah said, is the ultimate hope, I think, and the recognition that they're all implicated in one another is, for me at least, also going back to that question of power and building power. And so if we want those things, we need to sort of draw out or lay bare those connections. And also, I think if maybe make them concrete, make them, when we say touchdown in people's lives, I think that is to try to say, make these connections and these struggles concrete for people in the way that they, experience their day-to-day reality. And, when I was thinking about this question, David, when you sent it to us, I thought about how I actually had a sort of moment recently where I was researching something else. I was looking for something else. It was very casually. It was for something, sort of social. It wasn't sort of, research project or anything, but I was looking for certain information. And I'm a Sudanese immigrant to Canada. And so, I arrived here as a child. And so, I've always heard stories from my own family about different kind of historical touch points in Sudan. Of course, that's the, the kind of stories that they want to tell me. And my parents always love to tell a particular story about this British officer in Sudan who was, killed in a, or maybe late 19th century anti-colonial struggle. And so anyways, this story, they love to tell this story. And I was looking for some other information. And so that particular fight was being lost by the British. And so they had to send in reinforcements. And they sent in a team to extract this officer from Sudan. But because you have to travel up the Nile to get to the capital, Khartoum, they needed, skilled, I guess, river navigators, and the team that they put forward was the same team that had led a they led the expedition against Louis Riel and the Red River Rebellion. And so I thought that was just so fascinating for me because, obviously I hear this story from my parents, and that connection right there would have never really occurred to me or been apparent to me at all. But to think about the relationship between, you know, my parents who love to tell that story of this particular like anti-colonial battle and the connection it has with this place that I'm also occupying in this space that I'm also in, and this history I'm also trying to engage with in Canada, for me is like, I guess what I mean when I say make it concrete, you know, and make those connections concrete and make those, the connection between those struggles, lay out the implications for each other rather than seeing them as, you know, I need to also learn about this over here and somebody should also learn about me over here. And, you know, that kind of work and trying to think in those ways is, I think, really important if we want to build power. And ultimately, my hope for what we will do through this magazine, the stories will highlight, the people we'll be in conversation with, and hopefully the conversations we'll have after.
As the one member of the editorial board who's not based in Toronto, I live in Winnipeg, where there's a neighborhood called Wolseley, which is, of course, directly relevant to the story that you just told about anti-colonial struggles in Africa and in this part of the world where I live too. I would just add to this that I really hope that Midnight Sun is going to be a reference point, you know, that people in various parts of the Canadian state who identify with the kind of politics that we outline and with are really, really concerned and interested in the kinds of questions we're going to be dealing with. It'll be a place that they begin to identify with and read and write for, because, of course, people with politics like ours are currently very fragmented and scattered in this society. And so if we can in some way contribute to just changing that situation for the better, in some modest ways, and I think it will be an accomplishment. Maybe just a last question then is what people who are listening to this who want to support Midnight Sun can do.
Can I just add something real quick, just as a sort of like synthesis of, I mean, just listening to both of you talk about your hopes as well for the project, it occurs to me that, you know, maybe the best reply to the, you know, critique that we are certain to, you know, receive if we are not already quietly receiving it, that we're sort of, you know, an academic project or sort of just, you know, abstract or whatever, is that it seems like the overwhelming intention of the project is to build political relationships. And I think that intention is so important in distinguishing it from what people mean when, you know, they sort of criticize like an academic intention, which is, I feel like the heart of that critique or that sort of criticism is that, you know, it's like not about relationships. It's sort of like dealing with ideas sort of in abstraction from, or, you know, in separation from people and people's sort of lives and concerns. And I think that there is something really exciting to me about how we all seem to want to like find the synthesis or the, you know, the links between ideas and people's lives and concerns, and sort of, you know, build relationships in and through these sorts of, in and through is such a very, I guess, like a very academic sort of construction, but, you know, like build relationships, you know, sort of with these ideas as some sort of, you know, part of the process.
Just a publication where, you know, we've got, for example, the Mike Gouldock article, and someone who comes to the publication to read that article will hopefully in a few weeks also be able to read an article about a really positive experience of workplace organizing by postal workers, right? And vice versa. People who come and are excited by that article about postal workers organizing, you know, who might never have otherwise read a piece about pipeline blockades and resistance, you know, would find that. And the people who find both those things important and can see the links between them, right? Those are people that need to be in relationship with each other.
Totally. Yeah, I think it sort of acknowledges the reality that people often with this, you know, with this kind of writing or any kind of writing, people sort of bring their audiences to it. It's like the people who are reading, you know, any of these pieces will be like our kind of like fledgling audience as a magazine, but also like the people who those authors are already in relationship with. And so the ability for, you know, like, I mean, I'm sure, you know, like Selena's friends, for instance, who may have been reading, who may have initially seen, you know, Selena's like Instagram post about, you know, hairstylist organizing, would then, yeah, like on our homepage also have access to these other pieces about other struggles. And as you say, maybe there are some interesting possibilities for connections to be made there.
All right, just go back to the other question then, and that's what people who are listening to this conversation who'd like to support Midnight Sun can do.
I'm leaving it for you mainly, Daniel Sarah, because of course I can speak broadly about what support would look like, but I think there's of course maybe a first more practical way.
I mean, I think, look up our Patreon. I mean, I think that we're trying to raise some money to keep the project sustainable, because we are committed to paying for work to whatever extent is possible, paying for writing and stuff. And yeah, so I mean, that in terms of material support, we have a Patreon that could be, any contribution helps. And beyond that, I mean, I think just like having a look at like reading and sharing this stuff, where I'm sorry, these answers are so sort of like kind of obvious, but reading and sharing the work that we publish and helping it get to the people who need or may want to read it, who our reach still is very modest, right? We just launched a week and 2 days ago. So, I mean, I think just sharing, if you like the work that we are publishing so far, sharing it far and wide is really helpful. And certainly if you have a sort of writing practice or political organizing practice, or ideally both, but not necessarily both, that leads you to, that if you feel excited about what we're doing, then please do send us an email and suggest a piece of writing for the magazine. I mean, we're very flexible about what form that can take, and in terms of genre, form, length. And we're our contact sort of submissions section says like we're seeking good ideas and new comrades, and that's, I think, that's very much the spirit of it. And we don't have the capacity to publish like a ton of pieces, like, because we're trying to take a fair bit of time with what we do publish, or at least the time they need the pieces. But certainly, like, we're actively reading anything folks may want to share for possible publication in the magazine. I mean, again, it seems like really sort of like basic suggestions, but I don't know, maybe you have more interesting things to say, Lina.
No, it's the same. Of course, it's obvious, and still, it's really important if people are interested in this work to engage with the material more than anything, to discuss the articles with their own friends and loved ones, and, participate in a broader conversation that hopefully includes us and others. I think that's, that's a really good thing to ask for and a really good thing to get out of this. So if people want to support, I think, if they can support materially, of course, there is the Patreon, and that would be wonderful. And, the other main form of support is just to engage.
And of course, it's midnightsunmag.ca that you can find this publication. And I will be blunt. I really hope that listeners to Victor's Children will consider contributing a small amount of money on a monthly basis to support this publication, since we're really looking for a large number of people to give a little in order to help make it something that's this fledgling project can become sustainable. So thank you, Daniel, Sarah, and Lina, for this conversation, and look forward to having you back on Victor's Children at some point in the future.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, David.
That's it for episode 5 of Victor's Children. If you thought this was worth listening to, please let other people know about it, and also consider sharing it on whatever social industry platform you use. I'd also like to thank 2 people who have made important contributions to this show. Posey Leggett did the artwork, which is what you see online if you are on a podcast app, for example, looking at the show. And also I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, who does all the production work, and without whose efforts, this podcast would certainly not be possible.